Dementia is an awful thing to witness. And I know that for many, this is a personal thing that you have witnessed in loved ones and in family members. It's something that I have witnessed in my family as well. And it is horrible to see happening to people that we love. It often begins with little things. Forgotten appointments, repeated stories, things that you might just laugh off at first. But over time, it gets deeper. Names are forgotten. Faces become unfamiliar. Important memories begin to fade, and one of the hardest things to watch and experience is when someone no longer remembers the people who have loved them and cared for them for years. The love from the people who have loved them remains, but the connection between becomes clouded because memory is disappearing. And that's heartbreaking because memory is about so much more than facts and information. How we remember experiences, how we remember conversations, how we remember the connections that we have with people shapes both our own identity and our relationship with those around us, and how we live within all of those spaces. As Israel is standing on the edge of the promised land in Deuteronomy, Moses is very concerned that people remember. He is very concerned about God's people not forgetting. It's a repeated refrain through the that's a word jumble. It's a repeated refrain through the 2 chapters that are our focus today. In fact, it's a repeated refrain through a whole chunk of Deuteronomy. Remember, don't forget, remember. And this isn't about forgetting facts or dates or important bits of information. Moses is worried that God's people might somehow forget God, that they would slowly lose sight of who God is, what he has done, and why they belong to him in the first place. He's worried about a spiritual form of dementia where the love from one remains, but the memory from the other fades. And if there's one verse that sits as a neon sign blinking a warning over this larger spread of chapters from Deuteronomy that we have, it's chapter 8, verse 11. Be careful that you do not forget the Lord your God. Be careful that you do not forget the Lord your God. Well, at the start of our 2 chapters and the verses that immediately preceded our reading this morning, there is a difficult section. If you read that section, you can flip to it in your Bibles now if you haven't already done so, you'll see that God commands Israel to destroy the nations that inhabit the promised land. He says, I will drive them out before you, and you are to wipe them out. Now, for many Christians, including myself, these verses create in us a real tension because they seem difficult to reconcile with the God we meet in Jesus. They seem difficult to reconcile with the God that we encounter in the love of Christ and the God who tells us to love our enemy and to pray for those who persecute us. And there is a lot that could be said. In fact, whole books have been written on this idea because this isn't the only passage in the Old Testament where there is a command of this sort. And there are lots of things that Christians go, I'm not sure how to deal with this. Let me deal with this particular moment, at least briefly, because it's important in the context of what we're dealing with. But I want to say that there's more that can be said about this than we have time for this morning. Firstly, we need to know that this is not thoughtless genocide. God is not simply saying, Just wipe them out to clear the land so that you're free. He's not saying go out as if it's a paddock of grain and just plough it into the ground to clear it up, ready to go. That's not what's in play here. This is actually the presentation of an act of judgment that God had in his mercy, delayed, in his patience, waited generations for. If you need to know what act of judgment this is, you need to go back to Genesis 15. Moses already declared that judgment would come upon these people at a certain time. And this command is that act of judgment. So it's not a story of justification for any and every war, and it's not a story of ethnic superiority. In fact, Israel is not the hero of this story at all. But they are the mechanism through which God brings a judgment that he had promised and in his patience and forbearance had held off. Genesis 15, if you want to have a look at that. Secondly, the other thing here is that God's primary concern is actually the spiritual survival of his people. Again and again and again through this, he warns that the nations, if left untouched, if Israel simply goes and becomes part of this conglomeration of nations, they will draw Israel away from him. They will draw Israel's affection away from him. They will draw Israel's love and worship away from him and into the worship of other gods. Now that becomes really important because one of the dangers of chapter 7 that Moses is trying to carefully avoid is that Israel might look at the nations and conclude, God has given us victory over them, therefore we must be better than them. We must be superior. But God immediately destroys that idea. In fact, the very next paragraph reminds Israel, the opening of our reading this morning reminds Israel that they were not chosen because they were stronger or better or larger or more deserving than anyone else. They were loved. They were set apart. You are my chosen possession, God says. They were to know and be known by God. They were to worship God alone. But Israel was never meant to be the end of the story. God set them apart to carry his promises, ultimately to bring blessing to the nations through the Messiah. We always have to view these stories through the lens that these point us forward to God's redemptive arc, to his big story of saving a people to himself. Which means that even here in one of the difficult passages in the Old Testament, we are still reading a story that is moving forwards, that is pointing us towards Jesus, that is pointing us to the ultimate judgment on sin and death, and God's redemptive and saving power and his love shown to all of creation, towards God's invitation going out not just to Israel, but to every tribe and every tongue and every nation. And this, as difficult as it is for us to think about, is part of that story. God's big story, pointing us forward to Jesus. Now, I recognise that doesn't answer every question. It certainly doesn't remove every tension that we might feel. But it does help us to see that here Moses is not saying to Israel, God's going to make you the greatest. Just clear everybody else out and give yourself space to grow. He's not trying to make Israel feel superior to anybody. Actually, his focus is making sure they remember God's grace, God's undeserved merit that has already been shown to them. As we read this, we might be tempted to ask, why Israel? What made them special? What did God see in this people group that were lesser than the others, that were weaker than the others? Why did God pick them? But I want you to notice that Moses doesn't answer that question. He simply points to God's love. He doesn't ask why Israel. He says the Lord loved you. which suggests that actually Moses is interested in a different question altogether. He doesn't care why Israel. He's wanting the people to ask the question, how did we get here? How did Israel get here? How did we get to the promised land, to this moment in time, to the moment where we are going to start to receive the blessings, not just the sustaining of our life, not just the rescue from Egypt, but the blessings that were promised, the abundance of the land, the safety, the building of our nation. Because there's two stories that Israel could tell about itself. One story says, we got here because we are strong, faithful, and better than the other nations. We got here because we deserved it. And Moses is very careful to say, nah, absolutely not. That is not your story. In fact, he systematically dismantles every possible reason that Israel might point to. You were not the largest. You were not the strongest. You were not the most impressive. You were not even the obvious choice. In fact, Israel, if anything, your history has been one long story of God's patience with a stubborn and frequently rebellious people. So how did you get here, Israel? Because the Lord loved you. Unmerited, undeserved, and completely coming from God himself. Because the Lord loved you. Moses is trying to stop Israel from telling itself the wrong story, because if they tell themselves the wrong story about how they got here, they will eventually tell themselves the wrong story about everything else. If they start to think that they got to the promised land because of their own merit, they will eventually believe that their future prosperity is because of their merit as well. If they believe that they have earned God's favour, they will eventually believe that they somehow earned God's blessings and they deserve them. Give me my right will become the cry of their hearts. If they start to believe that they are the heroes of the story, then sooner or later God will disappear from the story altogether. That's what Moses is interested in. That's why towards the end of chapter 7 and through 8, Moses takes them back to Egypt. Remember, you were slaves, that you could not rescue yourselves. Don't forget who opened the sea and who defeated Pharaoh. Remember who brought you out. Then he takes them back to the wilderness as they wander through the wilderness. Remember the manna. Don't forget your hunger and your absolute dependence on God to supply the very thing that would keep you alive and nurture you. Remember the God who sustained you day after day after day. Moses is not trying to give them a history lesson in facts. He's helping them, he's teaching them how to read their own story. This isn't just a history book. Remember who's behind it, he's saying. Call to mind and consider your true story. Look back carefully and what do you see? Yes, you were led out of slavery, but by who? Yes, you were sustained in the wilderness, but by who? And you will see God's grace. You will see God's faithfulness. You will see God's patience. You will see God's provision. You will see a God who has been carrying you long before you ever realized it. God, Moses is saying, has already carried you through that danger. God has already carried you through that hardship. And God is going to go before you to drive out the nations in the land. He will be with you in the hardness of the battle to come. So when the good starts to happen, when life starts not to feel so hard anymore, when you start to receive the blessings that he has promised you, remember, remember. Don't rewrite the story. Remember the God who loved you when you didn't deserve it. Remember the God who rescued you, though you were not the greatest or the most obvious choice. Remember the God who sustained you, and don't stop relying on him when you begin to prosper. The message to Israel is not God loved you, therefore you're safe no matter what. Now go and enjoy your blessings. It's never stop looking back. Never stop understanding the story of how you got here. Never stop remembering what God has done for you. A passage that started with God judging the nations for their rebellion, if we push forward to chapter 8, verse 20, where we're finishing this morning, ends with a warning that he will not ignore the same rebellion in his own people. Moses is effectively saying, don't look at the nations and think that that could never be us. Remember what God has done for you, because if you forget him, what happened to the nations is your future. What God is about to do for you in clearing the land for you, in establishing you in this place, will be your future if you forget God. Listen to what he says in chapter 8. When you have eaten and are satisfied, when you build fine houses and settle down, when your silver and gold increase, then your heart will become proud and you will forget the Lord your God. Notice the progression. First, forgetfulness and pride, which leads to further self-sufficiency. And eventually, if we keep reading on in that section, it leads to idolatry, the worship of other gods, the worship of their status, the worship of themselves. And if that happens, Moses says, you will discover that covenant privilege is not a substitute for covenant faithfulness. Again, listen to how chapter 8 ends. If you ever forget the Lord your God, if you ever forget the Lord your God and follow other gods, I testify against you today that you will surely be destroyed. Listen to this. Like the nations the Lord destroyed before you, so you will be destroyed. This is how we can be certain that the command for destruction is not one of just violence or horror. It's an act of judgment, because the same judgment is proclaimed to be coming for Israel if they forget the Lord their God. The same judgment stands against those who would break their covenant with the Lord who rescued them, who brought them out of Egypt, who sustained them, and who establishes them. The judgment that falls on the nations becomes the warning that hangs over Israel. Remember, don't forget. Remember, don't forget. Moses keeps saying, because looking back will help you avoid the greatest pitfall, and that pitfall is beginning to live your life as though God is unnecessary, as if you don't need to rely on him. Perhaps that's still one of the great spiritual dangers that faces us today. We can see the obvious dangers of atheism within our culture. We can see the obvious dangers of persecution and hostility. We can see the obvious danger of consciously walking away from following God. I'm done with this. I've had enough. But in our modern world, I think we slide easily into comfortable forgetfulness. The quiet belief that our life is actually pretty much under control. Maybe even a belief that We got here ourselves, we picked ourselves up by our bootstraps, we worked hard, and now we've established ourselves. The quiet confidence that tomorrow rests in our hands. That our future, our next thing is all on us. But Moses says, be careful. That wasn't the true story for Israel. And Ulverstone, that's not the true story for us either. The true story always begins with grace. The true story always begins with the God who loved you before you deserved it. The true story begins with the God who rescued you when you could not rescue yourself. The true story begins with the God who remained faithful when you were anything but faithful. The true story begins with the God who loves so much that he sends his Son. That whoever believes in him would not perish but have eternal life. This brings us back to where we started. One of the tragedies of dementia is that treasured relationships disappear behind a fog. Moses is warning of a spiritual version of that very tragedy. God will never forget his people. God will never stop loving his people. But we forget him. We forget his grace. We forget his faithfulness to us. We forget his provision in our need. We forget his love. And when we do, we begin to tell ourselves a different story. A story where God's grace becomes invisible and we become the hero. Here in Deuteronomy, Moses wants Israel to remember and call to mind their true story. A story that begins not with them but with God. A story that begins with a God who loved them, who remained faithful to them, who provided for them, who brought them through the wilderness and is going to establish them. A story that began with grace. And as Christians, we know where that story leads. It leads us to Jesus. For the God who loved Israel is the God who so loved the world that he gave his only Son. Not because we deserved it. Certainly not because we earned it. And not because we were any better than anybody else. But because he loved us. God sent Jesus because he loved us. And so these words of Moses are just as applicable to us here today. Remember. Remember. Remember the true story. Remember the story that begins with grace and not achievement. Never forget that it begins with a God who loved you, who rescued you, who carried you, and who carries you still. Choose life. Remember the Lord.